Hey everybody, welcome to my video series on the history of the PvE meta in Guild Wars 2. Very few people still playing the game today were playing at all around launch, and those that were, very few of them were in what would later become the speed clear scene, such as it was back in 2012. With just a handful of us left, I thought it would be worthwhile to go over the meta from years past and explain how we got where we are today, starting from the beginning. The first episode in this series is going to be regarding dungeons, as they were the entire foundation of the PvE endgame community, especially at launch, and up until the launch of Heart of Thorns. So the first dungeon meta to develop was based less on the absolute fastest speed clears possible as it was just having smooth runs. As hard as it might be for a newer player to understand, dungeons were considered extremely challenging at launch before power creep and before ascended gear, and before people really embraced running builds with high DPS changed everything. There was a member of Death and Taxes, Strife, who put out dungeon guides for every path of every dungeon, explaining how to handle every puzzle, encounter, boss mechanic, etc. These guides were extremely popular because before that there were no dungeon guides available, which would show players how to beat the dungeons quickly and efficiently. Again, this was a time when your average player would consider clearing Ascalonian Catacombs Path 3 in under 30 minutes to be totally mind-blowing. The meta that D&T and Strife used for pretty much everything was 3 Warriors, 1 Mesmer, 1 Guardian. The concept was that with 3 For Great Justices from the Warrior and Signet of Inspiration from the Mesmer, the team would have Might and Fury absolutely covered. Additionally, the Guardian and Mesmer provided a lot of Reflex as well as CCs for trash mobs. Time Warp from the Mesmer was God tier, as quickness in those days gave a 100% attack speed increase instead of today's 50%. So basically this comp provided Warrior Banners, Fury, 25 Might, CC, and Reflex, and was extremely tanky as it had 4 heavy classes and a Mesmer. Most modern players would ask, why did they use Warriors for DPS and not Ellie for Thief? It wasn't just a matter of players not having figured things out well enough yet, though that was certainly part of it. At the time, the Elementalist trait Persisting Flames didn't provide Fury, so if you replaced one or more of the Warriors with Ellies, you would still have Might covered, but your team wouldn't have Perma Fury, which could be a huge liability. In the case of Thief, using Thorough of the Crime could replace For Great Justice in the Fury department, but it couldn't replace the Might, so your team would run into Might issues. Simply put, without Persisting Flames, there was no easy way to get both Might and Fury covered by a team that didn't have multiple Warriors. Looking back, we could have brought 1 Warrior, 1 Ranger with a Warhorn, 1 Ellie, and perhaps achieved better results, but it wasn't quite so simple, and it would have required a lot more of the individual players to succeed, since there was a single point of failure everywhere in the build. It was much simpler for the purposes of creating guides for the community to tell people to just roll Warriors, press the button for Great Justice, and have all their problems solved. The last feature worth mentioning in this original comp is that the Guardian usually ran at least partially Knight's gear, sometimes even Soldier's gear. Many dungeon bosses were aggro to toughness, and the idea was that the Guardian could hold aggro like a traditional tank and sustain himself with altruistic healing. In practice, this wasn't always useful and was rarely ever necessary, but at a time when pug groups could barely clear the content, having one essentially invulnerable party member who could hold aggro and also provide defensive buffs to the group was a huge help. So far, I've spent a lot of time talking about this particular group comp, not because it was the meta for so long, but because it was the foundation from which everything evolved from, and talking about the changes to the meta wouldn't make sense without putting it into this context. So the next step in the evolution was people improving at the content and not needing 2 support classes. People realized that for most content you could run with 4 Warriors and 1 Mesmer, or 1 Guardian, and clear the content even faster, so long as the players knew it very well, especially the 1 Mesmer. With 4 warriors and a mesmer, the group would have more than enough fury and might. The community realized that the 4th warrior was superfluous, and that perhaps better results could be achieved with a class like Thief, who had a higher damage capability and provided excellent utility in the form of stealth. Having stealth made dungeons like Arah go from next to impossible for pug groups to actually quite feasible. Also around this time, a player named Kitsune invented the first Elementalist Lightning Hammer build. This build essentially picked all the traits that granted a % damage modifier and used Lightning Hammer's powerful auto attack to deal damage much, much more than a warrior would be capable of. The drawback was the Ellie didn't provide the same utility as Thief did with stealth, and Elementalist was extremely squishy. That meant that only the most experienced players would get much out of an Elementalist compared to what they could get out of a Thief. The thought being that a Thief could carry very hard with stealth for players that weren't able to make trash runs themselves, whereas the Ellie without Thief would have to rely on personal play skill to get really anything done. This meta continued until there was a large revamp of many Elementalist traits. The most important for PvE was Persisting Flames, now granting Fury when you blasted in a fire field. The end result was that your team no longer needed For Great Justice to provide Perma-Fury. Instead of 3 warriors who each brought For Great Justice and a banner, you could bring 1 warrior who brought both banners, and it opened up multiple party slots for pure DPS. At this point, the PvE meta became 1 warrior, 1 mesmer, 2 elementalists, and 1 thief. With the elementalists pre-stacking might and spamming lightning hammers and fire fields, the group had much, much higher DPS than anything that came before, had all offensive buffs covered, and had stealth. This setup continued to be the basis of the dungeon meta moving forward. The next step in the evolution of the meta came when a community member, whose name is Guang, demonstrated the DPS potential of a Staff Ellie with the newly revamped Persisting Flames trait. Staff Ellie was a higher DPS than even the Lightning Hammer build, and synergized with it extremely well by putting down a permanent fire field with Lava Font for the Hammer Ellie to blast with his Lightning Hammer auto attacks in order to maintain Might and Fury on the team. Eventually, as teams became more adept at pre-stacking Might and Fury, you would see skilled groups pre-stack with Scepter Dagger, and then both Ellies would swap to Staff before entering combat, which made the Lightning Hammer build obsolete. This was an especially prevalent line of play that you began to see in record runs. Once people experienced the power of Ellies, especially Staff Ellies, it was like a shark smelling blood in the water. The massive damage potential of Elementalists and Thief began to be so high that most dungeon bosses were dying in well under 20 seconds. This made people explore the idea that Warrior may not be necessary at all. The extra DPS of the banners may not, in fact, have been worth it. Bringing a 3rd or 4th Ellie might just kill the bosses faster. We began seeing record runs for lower level dungeons where bosses died extremely fast using 4 Elementalists and 1 Mesmer. This became especially true when the overwhelming power of Fiery Greatsword came to prominence in the general public. The Fiery Rush skill on Fiery Greatsword number 4 was used without the boss being targeted against a wall so that all the ticks from it landed in one place on the boss, and it would do massive damage. Each Fiery Rush was somewhere around 300 to 400,000 damage, if I recall correctly. It was so much more powerful than anything else you could do in the game that the entire meta became warped around the skill to the point that the way teams approached every encounter was based on how they could manipulate a boss to get him against the wall in order to use Fiery Rush. Not only were team comps now heavily Elementalist, but the tactics and strategies hinged on Fiery Rush. Of course, a major balance patch addressed this, nerfing Fiery Greatsword into the ground. This patch also introduced a new warrior trait called Phalanx Strength, which granted Warrior the ability to stack might for his entire team simply by attacking with a greatsword. Additionally, Strength runes were buffed heavily to give significantly more might stacking capability and damage, which gave this build an even higher synergy. Warrior came back into the meta, but in a very weird way. Going so far into tactics resulted in a significant personal DPS loss for the warrior, since you also needed enough points in arms to get Forceful Greatsword, as Forceful Greatsword was in the arms trait line at the time, which precluded you from investing in strength in order to get Berserker's power. Warrior gained might support for the party, along with empowered allies. The addition of empowered allies to a warrior's repertoire, along with the powering down a bit of elementalists, meant that warrior had a place in the dungeons as in most groups. The flip side was that the synergy between staff and lightning hammer Ellie was unnecessary, and now both Ellies were free to go staff and didn't even have to worry as much about pre-stacking might. The next phase was the rise of the ice bow. This elementalist conjured weapon was less potentially game-breaking than Fiery Rush, but it had the unique ability in skill number 5 of the longest CC in the game before the breakbar system was implemented. The meta strategy became to use Deep Freeze on the boss, blast him with Ice Storm, have the Thief quickly strip the Defiant stacks off the boss, and have the second Ellie then Deep Freeze. In coordinated groups, bosses could be killed without doing a single attack. The meta comp essentially remained 2 staff Ellies, 1 Thief, 1 Warrior, and a Mesmer. This became the final form of the dungeon meta comp before Heart of Thorns. The last step in the pre-HOT dungeon meta evolution was a change to the trait system to have our current specialization system. Allowing every build to have 3 Grandmaster traits increased the power levels of all classes across the board. Warrior could now bring all its utility traits in tactics without sacrificing any personal DPS. Elementalist got a power-up from getting the entire water line and its plethora of DPS boosting traits. The meta itself remained unchanged in terms of comp, but all the builds were drastically powered up from where they had been only a few months before. The irony of the situation is that at the time, we considered this to be an insane power creep. But of course, little did we know the power creep that was going to come into the game with the Heart of Thorns elite specializations, as well as the power creep coming into the game with the revamp of the Defiant system becoming break bars and the 50% bonus damage to bosses when you broke their break bar. This brings us to the current meta, which is 1 Berserker Warrior, 1 Chronomancer Mesmer, 1 Tempest Elementalist, and 1 Druid Ranger. The 5th class is either a Daredevil if stealth is advantageous, or another Tempest if not. This comp is the evolved form of the older dungeon meta comp, adding in the Druid in place of a DPS for even more extreme party buffing capabilities. Currently, players' power and damage levels are so much higher that a recent player to the game probably wouldn't understand how dungeons were ever considered challenging content. Alright guys, I want to thank anyone who made it this far for watching the video. It was a lot of me just talking, but hopefully it was educational for the newer players and hit some nostalgia buttons for the older players. The next video series I'll probably do in this series will be for Fractals, so please stay tuned for that. If you like this series or you have any questions or have any memories from the old days that you want to share, feel free to hit me up in the comments below. But that said, thank you guys for watching. Have a great day.